From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
If you can imagine almost a stereotypical, beautiful summer English scene of golden fields and a little copse of trees and a path running through it, this murder happened in the most picturesque part of England.
My Sunday Times colleague Emily Dugan has been investigating a horrific 30-year-old murder which took place in the small village of Chillenden in Kent.
Lin Russell and her two daughters, Megan and Josie, Megan was 6 and Josie was 9, were walking home from school. They were also walking their dog, Lucy, probably feeling very safe in a very ordinary afternoon as far as they're concerned. A car pulled up in front of them on a kind of dirt track, and a man came out with a hammer and attacked the three of them. They were dragged into the copse of trees, tied up, bludgeoned with the hammer, and they were all left for dead. It was the most vicious attack. Lin and Megan both died. When police arrived at the scene, they assumed Josie was dead, and indeed her father, Shaun, was told that everybody had died. But in fact, later, when she did show signs of movement, she was rushed to hospital, and she did survive with catastrophic brain injuries, but she did survive nonetheless.
This brutal story became an infamous case in the 1990s.
This family were a very wholesome family, for want of a better phrase. The idea that a mother could be just walking home on a sunny summer's afternoon with her two daughters from primary school and attacked in such a vicious way, I think it just shocked everybody.
There was huge interest in the case across the UK, but for months and months, the police seemingly made little progress. There was no suspect to speak of. Until that is, Crime Watch aired an appeal.
I'm really appealing to anybody with information, however small, but in particular I think I'm appealing to somebody who may have an idea as to who the killer is.
It seemed to work. A drug addict with a criminal past called Michael Stone was accused, he was put on trial, found guilty, and he was given 3 life sentences. But did he actually do it? We'll hear from Stone's barrister about new developments in forensics and even about a potential new suspect as Stone continues to appeal his conviction and protest his innocence.
Why should we feel sorry for someone who has been wrongly convicted and spent 26 years in prison for a crime he hasn't committed? Because it could be you.
The story today: the convicted murderer, re-examined evidence, and a possible miscarriage of justice.
I'm Emily Dugan. I'm a reporter at the Sunday Times, and I'm particularly interested in miscarriage of justice cases and have worked on several investigations. The one that I spent arguably the most time on was looking at the case of Andrew Malkinson, who was in prison for 17 years for a rape in Greater Manchester that he didn't commit. And I worked on a Times podcast called 17 Years, The Andrew Malkinson Story, which looked in detail at how the case was deeply flawed.
The murder that you described a moment ago, the man behind bars who was convicted and is still behind bars for committing that is a man called Michael Stone. What got you interested in that story, his story?
Well, I had heard of the case. It's one of those cases that comes up periodically because there was so little evidence against him. And I think whenever you have a verdict that's a majority verdict like this was, so that means that a jury couldn't agree. And in fact, he was convicted twice by a majority verdict. That's where it was 10 jurors who said they thought he did it and 2 who refused to say that. So that's one hallmark of a potential miscarriage of justice. But there were other reasons why this case stood out, because there was never any forensic evidence against Stone. There was never any witness evidence directly linking Stone. You know, he was never picked out of a lineup. The whole case against him hung on these dubious cell confessions. And so, I had heard about the case, and I was speaking to Mark McDonald, who is Stone's barrister. And in fact, he's been Stone's barrister for 22 years now. He's been fighting this case. But he's best known for his work on the Lucy Letby case. He represents Lucy Letby in her attempts to overturn the conviction she has for the murder of 7 babies. But the case that, in a way, has stayed with him the longest is Stone's. And he has always maintained Stone's innocence.
He says this is maybe another Andrew Malkinson on our hands.
Yeah, I think perhaps the danger of comparing cases to Andrew Malkinson is one of the real things that stood out about that case was here was a man who had no previous history of violence. And with Stone, it is different. He did have a history of violence. He was a known offender to the police, and he did have issues with drug addiction. And so in some ways, when Stone comes forward as the suspect, it's an easy win for the police. He's not somebody who's going to be particularly persuasive to a jury. However, if the evidence is incredibly thin, and if we think perhaps deeply flawed, we should care about that as a society. We should care that the right person is in prison.
So tell us a bit more then about Michael Stone. Before all of this business with this murder that he's been convicted for, what did we know about him? What had he been up to?
So he had previous convictions for violent offences, including attacking a man with a hammer. He didn't have previous convictions for any attacks against women or children. But we knew that he had psychiatric problems. We knew that he was getting support. So the way that Stone first became a suspect is a whole year had gone by since the attacks happened. The police had no suspect, and they put out an appeal on Crime Watch.
As in the TV programme where they would do reconstructions and show e-fits and things like that.
So that night it goes out on Crime Watch with an e-fit that's been made from a woman who was driving a car near the scene and said she'd seen an angry man in a car suddenly pull out in the road in front of her, and she'd seen his face in the mirror, basically, in his car wing mirror. So she was creating this e-fit on the basis of a man glimpsed briefly in the mirror of his car.
This is the e-fit she compiled last year, and police today revealed that Josie has been shown this and says it's very like the man who ambushed and attacked her. He's in his 30s with chubby cheeks. His hair was gingery blonde and straight with a short fringe.
So, you can ask questions about how...
It's not the clearest view.
Yeah, how detailed an e-fit you can come up with from that. But nevertheless, it goes out, is broadcast on television. The next day, a psychiatrist that's treating Michael Stone says, I think it looks a bit like Stone. And obviously, he was a man who had a history of violence, and this became their lead.
When he was then arrested, Stone, how did the interrogations of police play out? How did they deal with him?
He just kept saying, it wasn't me, you've got the wrong guy. One of the problems he had is, he did have a serious problem with drug addiction. He didn't have a clear alibi. He just said, I don't remember what I was doing a year ago, which isn't surprising. But the police were able to trace a receipt to a cash converters in Chatham, which is about 40 miles away from the scene. That transaction had been about 4 hours earlier. Now, the police then said, well, he could have got there in that time. But there are still questions about why he would have been in rural Kent, miles and miles from where he lived, that day. There's nothing to suggest previously that he would have randomly driven around the countryside.
And in terms of actual physical evidence around the crime scene, what did the police pick up in terms of objects and the kind of things you would then interrogate and test?
One of the things about this case that really stood out at the time was that police believed they would find lots of traces of the killer. The scene was scattered with objects that should have left traces of the killer's DNA. So you've got, lunch boxes that the girls were carrying that the killer had gone through. There were fingerprints in those. You've got this bootlace that was found very close to where the bodies were discovered, which had DNA from the victims on it, so was clearly used. And I think they believed it was used to strangle one of them. And actually that bootlace, because it was such a long bootlace and it had some knots in it, it didn't appear to have been used in a shoe recently in terms of the marks on it. So the assumption was that was a tourniquet potentially used for heroin use, carried to the scene. And therefore you would have expected the killer's DNA to be all over it. But all of these objects, or many of them, were tested at the time. But obviously, we're talking 30 years ago now, and a lot of this forensic work was in its infancy. So the testing that was done didn't yield anything particularly helpful. One thing that could be known for sure, though, when Stone's DNA was compared with the traces that were found on some of these objects at the time, there was no link, nothing anywhere. I spoke to one of the original forensic experts on this case, Jim Fraser, on the phone recently. He was there on the scene that night. In fact, he was one of the first to get there. And he believes he did everything he could back then. But of course, the science wasn't advanced as it is now. Even so, he said it was unlikely you wouldn't find any DNA linked to your key suspect in a situation like this one.
I mean, I literally spent more time working on Michael Stone than any other single case in my career. Yeah, it is a bit surprising that there's no DNA from Stone there if he was the person who committed the crime, particularly on the bootlace, which is now to be attributed to him. You know, you're talking about somebody who attacked 3 people and a dog. Yeah. So that would have been frantic. You know, Lin Russell would have been frantic. It's not inconceivable, but it struck me as rather unlikely that this was a killer who was cold and completely unemotional. It probably has the hallmarks of rage. Whether Stone did it or not, he has been convicted on the slimmest evidence imaginable. So it's a case that sits on a knife edge, but it would be amazing if it could be resolved.
So there is objects that the killer clearly touched, including maybe possible murder weapons in the case of the shoelace, tested for DNA, none of Michael Stone's DNA on them.
Nothing at all. And one of the things that the police had said after Stone was arrested, you know, Stone's sister Barbara said that the police were saying a lot at the time, you know, this case, you don't have to worry almost because the forensics will come back and they will tell us if your brother was there or not and if he did it or not. I actually spoke to Barbara on the phone as well, and she told me about the moment when the police first contacted her.
You know, when the police first came, obviously I listened to them, but then I started questioning almost immediately. And then, of course, everything, there was so much emphasis. Every day the police told me they were waiting for this DNA to come back and that would prove whether he did it or whether he didn't do it. And they were so determined, so dead set that was going to be the case. And then I started to think, well, where is it? The 6 weeks is gone now. And then they never said anything. Then the Stott confession came and then we was told that the DNA didn't match. So this is just really getting dodgy, you know? There was never any evidence putting him there. Never. Because the more I asked, what's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Why are you saying it's him? There was nothing. There never was anything. Never. Never.
Tell me more about that confession. That was done whilst in custody.
So they managed to keep Stone in custody on another charge. I think it was a theft. During that time, the police had several supposed cell confessions. So several prisoners who were saying that Michael Stone had confessed this crime to them. Stone was convinced that people were trying to say that he'd confessed to them when he hadn't. So he got asked to be put into segregation in order for this not to happen. And during that time, he is supposed to have confessed to the crime through the heating pipe of his cell to the next door cell to an inmate called Damien Daly. Now, you have to ask questions about what incentive may or may not have been given to those prisoners. You also have to ask how reliable is a prisoner on remand, often for a serious crime, as a witness to say that somebody's confessed a crime. And as it turned out, that scepticism was fair, because the day after the conclusion of the first trial, their key witness turned around and gave an interview saying, "I made it all up. He didn't confess to me."
So Stone was convicted on the majority verdict, as you said earlier, in this first trial, and then that person says, "Oh, actually, he didn't confess to me."
Yes.
So then how did we end up in a point where he was then having another trial?
So he appealed on the basis that the evidence was flawed, and a retrial was ordered, saying we still think that he can be convicted on the basis of the evidence of one cellmate, Damien Daly.
But the result was the same. Stone was found guilty.
Yeah,
Majority verdict.
again a majority verdict.
And was sentenced to...
Given 3 life sentences.
Emily, you've been telling us about the case of Michael Stone, somebody who is still behind bars, serving 3 life sentences, you said, for murders which he still insists he did not do, and has large questions about the evidence that was used to convict him. You mentioned his barrister, who has been representing him and helping for a good long while, Mark McDonald. What has he been trying to do, and what successes have they seen of late on that front?
Well, once you've failed in the appeal court, your only way back to an appeal is applying to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC. So in his first application to the CCRC, which was on the basis that Damien Daly was unreliable and all sorts of questions about the evidence he gave, that was rejected by the CCRC in 2010. In 2017, McDonald applied again with a bunch of new evidence. But one of the things he really wanted to happen was more forensic testing. Because, of course, in the 30 years since this crime took place, forensic science has moved on considerably. And so McDonald and Stone's argument has been, please retest these exhibits. You know, science has become more sensitive in this area. And there's a chance that we may yet find some DNA that helps unlock the case.
So they have asked for what?
What they wanted was for the forensic case to be reopened. So they were asking the CCRC to present their own forensic strategy, reopen the case file effectively and say, OK, what could be retested, and then order it to be retested. But this has been a very long and laborious process. And essentially what happened is that the CCRC tried to reject the case. And it was only after they were threatened with judicial review that they kept it open. And it was only after Andrew Malkinson was exonerated in 2023 that they finally said, OK, we will look again at the DNA. Once they agreed to do this new forensic work, then there was a period where nothing was happening. And essentially McDonald went to them and said, look, if you're not going to make a forensic strategy, I will. And he commissioned Angela Gallup, who's a leading forensic scientist, and she's been credited with helping solve Damilola Taylor and the Stephen Lawrence cases, amongst others. He commissioned her to write a report reopening all of those old files and saying, OK, these are the objects that may yet give us some answers. And we've seen that 18-page report. And it is quite extraordinary, all of the exhibits which, assuming they're found, could actually help unlock this case again. Last week, I went to East London to talk to Mark McDonald while he was on a break from a case he was hearing at Snaresbrook Crown Court.
So my name's Mark McDonald. I am a criminal defence barrister. I was instructed to represent Michael Stone, I think in 2004. Most of my contact with Michael is actually over the phone. He pretty much at the moment is ringing me every day. What I can remember is someone who struck me right from the beginning, who was determined to prove his innocence. And I had no doubt walking away from him that I was representing an innocent person. Unlike probably any other client I'd ever had, is that he had an encyclopedic knowledge of his case papers. He constantly would say things like, if you look at page 1024, the second paragraph, I've spotted something there that is inconsistent to what was said at trial before the jury. What he did is that he acted and he behaved, and his whole life was about trying to overturn this conviction because he said he was innocent. And that is what he's doing today.
And how does his case compare to other miscarriages of justice cases or potential miscarriage of justice cases that you've acted in?
Yeah, I mean, they all are quite different. So, I do a lot of the nurse top cases like Lucy Letby, who I also represent. But that's a very different, because that's kind of expert-led or far more technical or scientifically complex. But this is not that case, because But the one thing that stands out about this case is the paucity of evidence. The fact that there is no direct evidence. There's no forensic evidence. There's no identification evidence. There's no mobile evidence. In fact, the evidence, the forensic evidence, points away from him, not to him. The only evidence there was is the fact that someone said he confessed to them of the crime, and that was it. And that person is notoriously an unreliable individual. And yet, simply, we can't overturn this conviction. We cannot persuade the CCRC to refer it back.
There are some who might say, well, Stone had a history of violence. He had his own drug addiction issues. I suppose two things, really. What makes you convinced it's not him? And also, there might be people who say, why should we care? This is a man who has this history of violence. Why should we care if it turns out this wasn't the specific crime he committed?
So let's break that down, unpack that. Yes, he did have previous convictions of violence. He was himself a drug addict, and maybe he was a street dealer of drugs. 50 miles away in the beautiful countryside of Kent, where a woman and her 2 children were viciously attacked and beaten to death, one surviving. That is so different from a low-level drug dealer that committed violence in the streets of Chatham. I mean, there was no violence against women, random attacks in the middle of a woods. It's just completely different. But why should we feel sorry for someone who has been wrongly convicted and spent 26 years in prison for a crime he hasn't committed? Because it could be you. And that's the problem with our system.
Let's deal with that confession evidence, because how much can we trust confessions, particularly supposed, overheard confessions in prison? And how frequently are these considered persuasive in something like a murder case? By a prisoner, no less, who's been convicted of murder.
Self-confessions became very fashionable for a very short period of time, 20, 30 years ago. You see, what the police were doing with the consent of the authorities was planting informers, planting security guards within prison to elicit information from individuals, tape recording that information, or telling prisoners that they were looking for that information, and prisoners would come forward with it. And this is really the fundamental problem with self-confession, is that it is innately unreliable. Because frankly, a lot of prisoners in prison would sell their grandmother to get out of prison. They would chuck anybody under the bus to do so. There is no code within a prison. Michael Stone, because everyone he even looked at was saying he confessed it, because people wanted to get something out of it. They wanted to get a reduced sentence, which is often one of the motivations to do it. So he knew this was happening because he was being told that this was happening. He was being told that people were saying he was confessing. He asked to go on to segregation duty, stick me in a cell on my own. Within hours of being there, Damien Daly, this drug addict, said he'd confessed to him. Well, maybe he told him something that wasn't in the public domain. No, everything was in the public domain. In fact, even more so than that, Damien Daly had a Daily Mirror in the cell with him. And in that Daily Mirror was an article on Michael Stone containing information that was somehow he had said to him in the confession. So, the whole thing would be laughable if it wasn't for the fact that a man has been in prison for 26 years for this crime.
And what has happened since 2023, which has opened up so many cases like Stone's?
So this is me speculating, but also with a little bit of knowledge of what's going on in the public in relation to the CCRC. I think they realised that they made a big error with Mampison. And as a result of that, I think they're beginning to relook and have greater focus on forensic reanalysis. The difficulty with Stone, of course, is that they've never been able to find a strand of DNA that assists the defence or undermines their case, i.e. a strand of DNA that points to a different suspect.
So they're fragments of male DNA, right?
They are, but they're so small, says the forensic experts, and then later says the CCRC, that it would be impossible to slim it down to identify any one or two or three individuals. Now, I know that there's now software available that allows a greater statistical probability analysis, so that may change with new forensic procedures. And of course, we know there's new forensic techniques that can get DNA where others in the past couldn't.
The CCRC is undertaking some testing. We don't yet know what.
Yes.
How often would they actually do that? Does that feel like quite a big breakthrough in this case?
I'm hesitant to say, that I've danced around the living room because I've done it, because I managed to persuade them to do forensic testing, because it's a sort of thing they should be doing anyway. It is also, it's more of a disappointment that they haven't done it in the past, in the immediate past. It's interesting because, what frustrates me most is the time that it takes for things to happen. There is this culture, and it's not just at the CCRC, that you ping an email and you wait for the email to come back. It doesn't come back over after 2 weeks, so you ping another email. And that's the frustrating thing, is how long it takes to do something. So that, maybe you want me to say, yay, it's a breakthrough, we're doing it. I'm not going to say that, because what's the breakthrough is finding the DNA of the murderer. That's the breakthrough. When this conviction is overturned, this will be worse than any other case that's come before the CCRC in the way that they've managed this case.
Worse even than Malkinson?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Emily, we mentioned at the very top of the episode the case of Andrew Malkinson, which you did a lot of very good reporting on, now proven case of miscarriage of justice. And in that, if memory serves me correctly, one of his main issues was how useless the CCRC was, in his opinion. It looks like, again, here we've an example of, as Mark McDonald and Michael Stone might have it, the CCRC not doing what they should be. Yeah,
it's certainly the case that this is something that has sat on their desks for a very, very long time. And the big question is whether the new head of the CCRC, Vera Baird, who says she's there to shake things up and turn it around, obviously since she's come in, there are positive signs in this case. For example, the fact that they're now going to be doing their own forensic testing. But undoubtedly, the history of this case is not a positive one for the CCRC.
Mm. You've got your hands on this forensic strategy. What is new or interesting from that you've discovered?
Well, what Gallup found was that there were quite a few key items that either haven't been tested very much or not in the relevant places, or they've not been tested at all. So, for example, there were fingernail scrapings taken from Lin's left hand, which appear not to have been tested at all. Also from the family dog, Lucy, there were swabs taken from the dog's teeth and from the back of the dog that, again, may yet yield some human DNA that doesn't appear to have been tested for before.
It sort of seems incredible that they weren't tested at the time.
Right. And we don't know how much of this is poor record keeping. It's possible some of it was tested, but certainly from what she can see, it wasn't. The one exhibit that Michael Stone has always been convinced would be most useful is a bootlace that was found 45 metres from the entrance to the crime scene. Because it was stained with the victim's blood and because it had been handled, therefore, by the killer, police were pretty sure it could lead to the murderer. There was also the argument that it might have been a tourniquet for heroin use, and therefore it might have been not only handled by him, but potentially put into his mouth, the killer's. So when these advances in DNA happened, one of the first things that McDonald said is, okay, great, let's have the lace, let's retest it. But in 2010, when the CCRC tried to get hold of that lace, Kent police said all they could find was an empty envelope.
Oh.
Then, at a press conference, or I think in a press notice, they claimed that the shoelace had been tested to destruction. 10 years later, in 2020, the lace suddenly reappeared. Kent police had found it. And so now it can be tested. And so Angela Gallup, she's developed this strategy where you basically unpick the crime scene and you start again. You say, look, These were all the items that the killer might have touched. And now we've got this much more powerful forensic tools that we can use. And so she's advocating for retesting as much as possible. And the question now is how much the CCRC will actually do. But the big progress that's been made now is that the CCRC have instructed Eurofins, which is a major forensic laboratory, to start testing right away on some of the objects that are easily available.
In terms of what happens now, they actually get to action that forensic strategy and get to test things. That obviously might not exonerate him. It could incriminate him, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the risks anybody takes if they're hoping that forensics will exonerate them, that only works if they didn't do it, clearly. And while McDonald is absolutely clear that he believes Stone to be innocent, there is obviously a chance that the forensic link ultimately leads back to Stone. One of the things that might suggest otherwise is the fact that he's pushing so hard for this DNA to be tested. Because if there's even the tiniest possibility that it proves it's him, why would you want to reopen that? And not just now at the time that he's coming up for parole, but why would you be pursuing that all these years when it could have made things much worse for him?
Say he is exonerated. The question that then returns is, well, who committed this awful crime 30 or so years ago? I mean, are there any other leads or ideas?
So one of the key points in the latest application to the CCRC was the fact that a serial killer called Levi Belfield has confessed to this crime.
The killer of Millie Dowler.
Exactly. You know, he is a known serial killer. His MO is attacking people, well, specifically women, with a hammer, and he's known to attack children too. He also, some would argue, resembles the EFIT. And in fact, that very witness who created the EFIT has since said she believes that it was Levi Belfield she saw.
And is there any evidence other than that to say that it might be Levi Belfield?
Well, I mean, it does get confusing because he made this initial confession to, I believe it was a Home Office intelligence source, and then he retracted it when asked about it. And only later, after work with psychologists, did he then actually say, no, I did do this, and give quite a detailed signed confession. But there are people who believe he is lying and lying for attention. And there is some contradictory evidence here, because in this signed confession, there are some details that don't add up. One could argue that's because he was, you know, this is many, many years later. He hadn't remembered the exact details of where each victim was. But his ex-girlfriend from the time has said to me that she was with him on that day and that they were celebrating her birthday and that there is no way he could have done it. But I suppose the key question is, whether it was Levi Belfield or not, there isn't the evidence there to prove beyond reasonable doubt that it was Stone.
What do the people who knew and loved the victims make of all of this? Because on the one hand, they had closure, but now that might be taken from them.
In the past, I think Lin Russell's husband, Shaun, and the father of the girls, said he wasn't convinced or hadn't been entirely persuaded that Stone was the perpetrator. But as I understand it, that position has changed. My guess is, I mean, I did contact the family to let them know that the article was going out, and they didn't want to comment further. And I suppose I can imagine for them it's awful, this getting reopened. You know, one of the challenges of a case that doesn't feel like it's been totally proven is that 30 years on, there are still questions being asked and people are still talking about the worst thing that ever happened in their lives. And that must be incredibly difficult.
That was Emily Dugan, a reporter for the Sunday Times. We reached out to the CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, for comment. A spokesperson told us, quote, "A review into this application is ongoing. We are exploring all the possibilities the application raises to determine whether Mr. Stone may have suffered a miscarriage of justice. They say our test for referring a case is that there is a real possibility that the Court of Appeal would overturn his conviction, a test which was not met in any of the earlier applications. It would be inappropriate, they say, for us to discuss the case or make any further comment while the application is being reviewed." We also heard from Kent Police. A spokesperson from there said, quote, "Following 2 trials at which Michael Stone was found guilty by a jury on both occasions and an appeal to the High Court, he remains convicted of the murders of Lin and Megan Russell and the attempted murder of Josie Russell in 1996. They say Stone made an application to apply for a judicial review in respect of his conviction in September 2012. The Honourable Mr Justice Blake ordered that permission for the application should be refused. Kent Police has supported the Criminal Cases Review Commission by providing all the relevant information required throughout its ongoing review of Stone's conviction, and will continue to do so. We will see what happens going forward, but for the meantime, that is it from us today. Thanks for your company. The producer was Harry Stott, the executive producer was Tim Morklate, sound design and theme composition was by Mal Assetto, and I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.